The great AI draft has started, Matt. Employees are being forced to train AI to replace them. Meta forcing 7,000 of their staff into this AI task force, as well as all staff members have a mandatory piece of software on their laptops, their computers at Meta that is tracking all their keystrokes to train AI and train their replacements. Um, Meta staff themselves have coined this the great AI draft. They've softened on it slightly, but they're not the only ones. In fact, I know of a college-age kid who's doing an internship this summer, and on his first day on the internship, they said, hey, this is what you're going to be doing. This is your job. But your secondary job is to train AI, and you officially are going to be the last batch of interns doing this job because it won't exist next year. So it's happening, Matt. The AIs are literally taking our jobs. Good, bad? What do we think about this?
Well, yeah, now this is a huge issue at Facebook, and they even said that they're going to improve the snack budgets in recompense for this. But I think there's two things happening simultaneously. One is this concept of token maxing, where employees were measured on how much AI they were using. And that is kind of very adjacent to the concept that we want you to actually use AI to do your job, not because AI is better, but because that essentially digitizes workflows. And then you can go back and say, look at all the work they just did here. Just do that yourself, right? So I think this is something that won't necessarily take people's jobs in the short term. As you know, I generally don't find myself doing the same thing twice. And anytime I do it over and over each month, it's always like nasty and hard. Many of the things that many things that could have been automated have been automated over the last 20 years. So I don't know how much juice they're going to get out of this. But then the second part at Facebook Meta, Feta, is that they've been taking like senior engineers, like people who signed up top of their class at, this and that school, and said, you're labeling AI training data, right? And, they brought in Alexander Wang, who had a company called Scale. And Scale, for the most part, was a company that labeled data. So, it's you bring in a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, might be part of it. So I think there's a bit of culture clash.
But it's a
Algorithms are not.
real issue we're trying to solve here in the world of AI, right? So there was an estimate I think that you and I came across a while ago that 4% of human knowledge has been used to train LLMs, leaving 96%. I've experienced the practical constraints of this. When you sit down with a business and you're looking to generally automate something that hasn't been automatable until this point, and you do this traditional digital transformation process, which starts with, okay, let's blueprint this existing process, right? If you have a way of running your business, running a process that is unknown to the LLM, it's tacit knowledge, institutional knowledge, it has to be captured, it has to be digitized in order for AI to be able to do something with it. So it's a very practical constraint. It makes a lot of sense that there are efforts, like I'm beginning to see a lot more ads for kind of personal recording devices that just sit in your pocket, listens to meetings, transcribe them, and build a knowledge base upon which your AI will kind of operate. I think I have two issues with this particular approach from Meta. One, it's mandatory, right? You have literally no choice, and it's hard not to perceive this as, hey, you're doing this to take my job, right? So there's, in typical Meta fashion, they haven't approached it in a very humane type of a way, at least in a way that it's presented that people might accept it. And the second issue, I agree with you. I think that the technical approach to capturing that knowledge makes little to no sense. What is the signal that I want to listen to as AI to try and understand that tacit knowledge? Me clicking buttons isn't really it. That's not
You'll
where
say,
the data is encoded.
that's the thing. It's like it might look the same. And again, let's differentiate. I think that also companies like Meta and Google have been extraordinarily bloated because their margins are so high. So from a financial standpoint, if you make like Google makes $200 billion a year in profit, let's say that your average employee costs $500,000, which is probably about right, a year, fully loaded. Expensive employees. They have 200,000 employees, right? Like, yeah, that's they're. I mean, 200,000 employees times 500,000 each is about $100 billion a year, right? And then they have $200 billion a year on top of that in profit, and that's after all of their compute costs and stuff like that. So even if they cut all of their employee costs in half, it moves their margins up, it moves their profit up, a few percent. On the other side, what happens if a new technology like AI comes out? You just want all these people around. You want to just have this high density of talented people with the systems and things in place. So because of the high margins and the massive size of these businesses, I think both Meta, Google, and those kinds of Amazon to a much lesser extent have had bloated costs. And the reason Amazon's different is they do have AWS, but then they also have a low margin. Most of their employees are in a low margin business, which is service delivery. But if you have a very high margin business, you probably want something that looks like being overstaffed and somewhat wasteful, because the most important thing is if a challenge like Instagram appears, you want to be able to either buy it, or if a challenge like Snapchat appears, copy it. And that's what they did with Snapchat and then TikTok. They've been able to very fast follow. But that means a lot of those people aren't doing much the rest of the time. So now AI has appeared. And instead of them copying, what was the Snapchat stories or copying TikTok and Reels, now you need to copy whatever OpenAI is doing. And Facebook, that's been Facebook's business, but they have all these people laying around. And so I think some of them are like, well, I'm not doing my job anymore. Like, you've never had a job. You've been essentially wasteful. I remember talking to somebody who was in their, what's it called division? The headsets, reality division, or whatever.
Oh, the metaverse?
Yeah. And it was, I think it was a software engineer working in adjacent to the headsets. And I remember asking about management, because I asked everybody about their management. And they had a ratio of, I think, 4 engineers and 4 managers. They had an HRBP, they had an engineering lead, they had a project manager and a product manager. So 4 engineers, 4 managers. That's a 1-to-1 manager ratio at that level. And then, of course, each of the product managers has a director. I think they keep those ratios at something like 15, 17 to 1. So, I mean, that's much leaner, but like there's more managers than engineers. And you remember like the year of lean, it's just like, you got to have maybe like 2 people, 3 people per manager. And so they had like a very labor intensive culture, but again, they have insane margins. Instagram just prints cash, and it's not like if they cut people, it's really going to have that much for the bottom line. They need to worry about what's coming next. And every time there's a new TikTok, and OpenAI is definitely much bigger of a threat than TikTok.
So are you saying that that Meta has this, what appears to be an effort to apply AI to existing tasks being done by Meta employees? By the way, I haven't introduced the term yet, but it's called task mining. So keep an eye out for that one. It is growing. Microsoft has a product actually around it as well. But are you saying, Matt, that they're focusing on the wrong stuff here in terms of the task mining, or the other?
I think the people complaining that they're labeling or tokenizing, I think a lot of what occurs at Meta doesn't need to occur whatsoever, whether or not AI does it or a human does it. There's just a lot of stuff. I mean, like they take bets. Mark Zuckerberg has been great at acquisitions and great at fast follows. He hasn't yet had a big win. There's no reason the metaverse. I mean, maybe the metaverse was about to succeed, and then AI came and took all the wind out of their sails. Who knows? But yeah, I think that to hear a Meta or a Google employee, it's a different beast than the employee, say, of an insurance company or somebody who's doing something over and over again, where there's thin margins, huge value in automating that. Because I think if the average Meta employee automated their job, I don't even know if they would get fired. They'd probably just go and train data or whatever is the marginal thing. I think it's very culturally disruptive. They fired a lot of people in the last year or 2 years. So bad vibes, but again, it's not fun to be following. It's fun to be leading, and that's never been Meta's strength over the last 20 years.
Fair point. Fair point. All right. Let's move on to the next topic. First of all, it's been refreshing not to lead with fable and mythos and all of that. But that said, I guess we'll get back to what did we learn this week?
Well, let's actually segue from that, because I think what you brought up is, are companies optimizing the wrong thing? And I think looking at tasks and workflows, by and large, is not that interesting, because again, most of the things that could have been automated have been automated. Maybe you can, go one tier down because you can develop software faster. But there's actually something I think that's much more critical, which is, what are the outcomes that people can deliver very quickly with AI now that they couldn't before? So not copying the past. And I think that's the most interesting story. And probably the right place to start is, yeah, we're not talking about Fable this week. We're tired of it. But this week, Coinbase announced that they had actually moved to worse models. So instead of chasing Mythos and Fable, they said they had move to worse models and had significantly cut their costs by about half on AI, while increasing their token spend. So when you go to the less capable models compared to the frontier, they're smaller models so that each token takes less inference. And I think this is a very important event for us to watch, for us, because we've been talking about every time each model got better, we always went to the very edge. We went to the cutting edge. Why? Because whatever task you're doing, it was almost good enough for AI. Coinbase had been doing, I think, tracking. Who knows exactly how they're doing this, but imagine a company like a Coinbase presents themselves. They're tracking the actual impact of AI applied to these different problems, looking at the outcomes they're driving. Are we reducing our brokerage costs or our crypto this or that? I don't know what Coinbase does really, like crypto stuff, but they knew exactly what it is. And then what they realized is, instead of having to use Opus, they could use Sonnet. And that means instead of each token costing $50 per million, it cost $5 per million. And so they were able to change a whole bunch of their workloads and basically route them onto these worse models, but it still got the job done. So they used more tokens overall, did more work with AI while reducing their costs. That's really important. We haven't really seen that, and we haven't seen much. We've been talking about people getting rid of people, like, hey, we fired all these people and used AI, but we haven't heard of we fired the really good model and started using the worst model, because we got mature enough in our processes to understand that the worst model is still good enough for us. And so now we're optimizing the cost. That's a big shift.
Well, the thing that really caught my attention in that Coinbase example was, not only were they looking to drive cost down, but they were receptive to using open source Chinese models, which they are using. Kimi, Quen as well, I think. So what does that tell you? Like, Coinbase, pretty big entity, right? Doesn't totally surprise me that they're smart enough to optimize their costs. It's great that we're there. It marks a shift. But there's comfort. They're comfortable in using these Chinese models. I don't know when they made that decision, but I feel the last 2 to 3 weeks have really opened the door to the conversation of like, well, hold on a second here. We are re-architecting our businesses around AI and using these models. And we need to, A, make sure it's cost effective, but B, we need to make sure we have access to them. So this concept of, local maybe actually isn't really the right word, but models that I have total control over.
Well, yeah, if you build a box and you can get your tasks done with an AI, and you kind of like, you reach that maturity where you're concerned with cost, maybe it just sits there all day long. You got a few GPUs and it sits there all day long and it cranks through your HR reports or whatever. And each month you have enough. Well, what you want to do at that point is not try to insert a better model in there. You want to just seal that box up, monitor it, make sure it doesn't get turned off. And then now you're done with that. And that's how we treat software too, right? Like, once you have a mature product, you see this, like, very rarely do they get updated, right? Like once it's mature, you're like, we'll fix the bugs and we'll do some performance improvements. But for the most part, you leave it locked, as if it works. No one knows why software works or doesn't work, or why it resonates or doesn't resonate. You think you might know. There's a few people who probably have a very good idea, made a lot of money. But for the average company, If you solved a problem, it's solved. Walk away, go focus on the actual constraints in your business now. And so having a model that might be a year old or a year and a half old might be totally appropriate now that we've reached this threshold where people understand that models are good enough. And that just hasn't been the case, that there hasn't been real business problems. Like a year ago, we were talking about 95% of projects fail. Well, now there's projects that are completely solved by an AI that's 6 months behind the status quo. We have measurement techniques and we're mature enough in using them that we can optimize costs and reduce it. And if it's running on your own hardware, fine, done, sit it. There's a HR GPU cluster and that's that. And it can run for 5 years. And we're probably going to start seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a version of that in the legal space as well. I forget the name of the huge law firm, but it's one of the top 3 or 4 building their own internal model. A year ago, that would have been ridiculous. 3 months ago, that might have sounded ridiculous. Here we are today with open source models that potentially could be the basis of that. And then it's kind of the marriage of where we started, right? Where you are an entity, a business who has particularly in the legal space, right? You know exactly how to do this. You've got all the partners, all the associates, all the paralegals who've been doing this for a long time. And if the technology is now such that you could potentially train your own model and you have that tacit institutional knowledge, you can marry them together, there's real competitive advantage. Now, the question is, Coinbase, a technology company at its core, a law firm, even a large law firm with a lot of resources, are they going to have the capability to actually train a model and then build an application around it to make it usable? I don't know. But it is very surprising to me how quickly the winds have shifted in the last
Yeah,
3 to 4 weeks.
stranger things have happened. I think last year, we should go back and look at the transcripts of our episodes and have an AI that we can ask, like, which episode did we say this in? But I felt like it was sometime last fall, right before Claude Code. We really had that Claude Code November, December, and the November release, and that became huge. But it was like we were saying, like, even if the AI never got better, this is around the time of like Opus 4. Like, even if it never got better past this, Opus 4 was so good. Even if it never got, there's a ton of things we could figure out. And I think if you look at Coinbase as a bellwether and our own, there's things I just do with AI now. I don't need the best model. I don't really care. Might as well use the best model. Who knows? But if you're a cost sensitive business, I think we've had 9 months of good enough models. And so that means you can use Chinese models. You can use open source models. You can go use Sonnet 5, which is worse than Opus 4.8. But if Opus 4 was already good enough, Sonnet 5 is definitely good enough. And you can just use those and you can do things like agentic harnesses and better context management. And you've just reached this state where there's big, hairy business problems, mostly that can replace people, where old AI is good enough. And that's a new thing. It's closely related to the topic of our previous couple episodes, which is we might not get the best models anymore either. And we might get them months behind, but that's still not a problem. Right now, we are kind of like 2010 with cloud. It's like everything probably needs to move to cloud. The cloud didn't really get that much better between 2010 and 2018, but we still saw almost everything migrate. So I think it feels, just in the last few weeks, it feels like we've really crossed that threshold where obviously coding's been good enough for months and months, but there's so many other applications where old AI is more than good enough. And now we're getting more clever with it. We're better at selling the business case and convincing the boardroom, and we're seeing it percolate and diffuse into companies.
Yeah, so the term I've heard is kind of the capability overhang, this idea of this thing can do it, but we haven't yet caught up to essentially in the application layer. And I wonder, is that kind of why the markets haven't completely shit themselves? Because we're looking at, as of today and yesterday, it's looking very much like both OpenAI and Anthropic are going to have to push any new models through the White House. So we've shifted into a very different paradigm now, particularly for the frontier model builders. Now it's a regulated market. You can decide how regulated, whatever, but it's now regulated. It was unregulated. It was a completely globally open market.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's one dude perhaps with Trump sitting behind him saying, no, you can or you can do that. But there's one guy, there's no set of rules, there's no transparency, there's no precedence. And so it's interesting to me that who knows what that means for the IPOs for those guys,
Mhm.
but bring it back to the capability overhang. Folks like us playing and living in the application layer, we're not really that bothered because there's a shitload more stuff to do. And maybe I'll kind of illustrate the point. We record this on something called Riverside, which we've been using from day one. And I remember doing the first edit on the first episode. And I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. Like it just works so well. There's a different user interface. We're like, wow, we're like plowing through this so quickly. And they announced this morning version 2 of their product, 18 months into it. Now, who knows what it does, how well it works, but just reading the press release, it's much more capable. It's doing a bunch more stuff. That's fantastic. But it just gives you a sense of the timeline. It took 18 months to get to version 2.
I think for a while, we've been having that issue like we had with Uber, where they were trying to train people and establish that there was a market. So for a while in summer San Francisco, you could get, if you were doing like the Uber line, whatever the Lyft line, there was Lyft line and Uber sharing rides, whatever. You could go anywhere you wanted in a certain part of San Francisco, which included my house, for $2. It was insane. And they were just training people. If you want to go somewhere, don't ride the bus, don't walk, don't drive your car, take Uber's $2, right? So then I moved away, COVID, all that stuff. You kind of didn't use Uber in the same way you did back in like 2014, 2016. Came back, it was like $24 for an Uber ride, the same distance. Like, oh man. And so what happened is Uber became profitable. It actually has a great stock price too. It went through that training the users and then finding what is the equilibrium market price. I think that also happened both in the LLM foundational model companies giving away essentially loss leading. So for instance, for a long time, OpenAI since, for the last 3-4 years has been fantastically unprofitable in its inference. Ahead of its IPO, Anthropic, competitive, announced they have positive gross margins because they've had this really like nice boost from Claude Code. So a huge amount of use. They've been charging a lot for it, but they had this kind of unique capability, so they're able to charge. Well, today, OpenAI announced that they had found a hack and they had tested it at scale now that reduced their inference cost by half. And I think that was something I had talked about 2 or 3 episodes ago, where it's like, nobody knows how inference works. Can you do some clever caching thing, or can you catch 85% of things and route them into one half of your tree, or do model switching yourself and get a good result? Well, whatever they did and they tested with users, it reduced their inference cost by half. So let's say that you were at zero profit, right? Instantly you have 50% gross margins, right? Instantly on, how much, like $30 billion a year in revenue. So suddenly they have every 50%, that 50% operates at $15 billion in cash flow from one small innovation. These are very interesting times, but I think if you look at the Uber example, there's also a bunch of companies that are basically subsidizing us to use these tokens. We all know we would pay more for the AI, but we're getting a deal. And so we're going to both pay more. They're going to find some hacks. We'll reach market equilibrium, and probably the most capable models we wouldn't be able to afford. It would be like $2,000 or $3,000 to do these useful things with them. The things that we care about, which is like, hey, could you write this report for me every week? It's like, we don't need a superhuman AI running to absolute margins on the giant cluster. You can do that for $10. And so I think I'm trying to paint the picture. There's going to be a convergence between people stop subsidizing, people paying what's useful to them, people optimizing on the margins, and we'll reach a system like we have with Uber where it's way more expensive than it used to be, but I'm not going anywhere else. And now we have these profitable companies, and they're releasing innovations like Waymo and things like that. I think we're just not in equilibrium. So all these like costs and overhang and everything, companies haven't figured it out how to use it. Everybody's still in a
Yeah.
infantile state.
One of the reasons I love being part of and running businesses in the startup phase is profitability, whatever. right? It's all about top line. Can we grow these businesses? What can we do? And at some point in time, we've got to be grown-ups and go, okay, the growth's going to flatten a little bit. Now let's talk about efficiency. Let's, whatever
Mhm.
that means. Predominantly, it's going to mean, margin. It feels like that's literally that shift we're doing in the last couple of weeks, right? You shift into a world where, and I don't know this is the trigger for it, but you're like, oh shit, we're going to get regulated here. Okay, so that's going to slow the growth down. So part of the story now needs to be an efficiency type of a story.
Mhm.
So we saw Anthropic announced Sonnet 5,
And
cheaper.
they say it's basically Opus 4.8 Lite. So whatever you like about Opus, you can use Sonnet 5, which means you're going to have faster inference. So whatever you're doing, it'll just come back faster. If you're coding, instead of taking an hour, it'll take 25 minutes. And instead of costing $30, it'll cost $12, so those kinds of
So,
optimizations.
Anthropic, positive margins, we're making money. OpenAI, hey, we're going to start making money because we're going to drop the cost of inference. There's a lot more of the narrative being devoted to efficiency. Does that mean that we're seeing the end of the crazy growth?
Who
Is that
knows?
is this the
I
end?
think that's a very good question. And we can have a hypothesis that we might be at the end of people feeling like we're going to have a singularity. And this AI 2027 scenario where the government doesn't quite regulate fast enough, we've gone from no regulation to a lot of regulation. Okay, so that takes the singularity a little bit off the table. What replaces the singularity is our model going forward for how AI is going to affect the world. Well, in the singularity, it just took over everything. It starts doing all this weird biology and robotics, and it starts influencing world leaders. And we kind of just go down a path where we lose agency, and the singularity kind of just takes our existing human lifestyle and replaces it in a way that makes it unessential, or maybe that kills us, right? That was the AI 2027 singularity. But what we've seen in the last few weeks is the government has gone from, I think Samuel Hammond said, he's like, we went from absolutely no regulation to like how we regulate Cuba and terrorism, like in 1 week, it's
We're
like we went.
regulate we're regulating Max. Regulate Max.
Yeah, so the Trump administration went from no control to completely pulling the collar, the chain on Sam Altman and Dario. It's like, no, you're not going to release whatever you want. We're going to check it first, which is like, I wish it was done through the Congress so there was fewer opportunities for corruption. But only Nixon could go to China. Only Trump can actually regulate tech without Mark Andreessen losing his mind. Like, all right, whatever. Trump does it. He'll have the Democratic Congress to worry about in 6 months if the changes. Okay, what replaces that though? What replaces the singularity idea? Equilibrium, markets, trade-offs. And what's the evidence there? Coinbase trading off, right? They are using worse models for less money. Okay, that's different than the singularity where intelligence, the returns to intelligence were always super positive. And in this case, the returns of intelligence are negative. The higher cost of the big models wasn't worth it, so they went to the smaller models. We see people using Chinese models, which are important because they're less expensive. They have trade-offs in control and security relative to being state of the art. And we're seeing companies now adopting, instead of just doing wild things, they're kind of adopting in like how much AI can replace how many people. Ford today announced they hired back 300 high-end engineers that they had replaced because of their AI story, and they realized AI is not quite good enough. And so we're seeing not just all layoffs, but we're seeing higher backs, and this equilibrium's improving. Well, what that means is there's going to be many places where people in the application layer, this is kind of our focus, which is if it's not a singularity, then there's going to be these surfaces of trade-offs and give and take and new capabilities coming out, which advance that surface marginally. And people will need to make choices to develop new products or adopt new products or change how their budget's allocated. Well, that's all consulting and application development. SaaS might even come back along these because people are going to have a stable enough, even that frontier is advancing as it has with companies like Uber. It's stable enough that you can build businesses and applications and products, and it's not just a runaway growth. And at the same time, we haven't seen any real slowdown in employment across the economy. So equilibrium's good. I love equilibrium. If you're excited about having a job and meaning in your life, equilibrium's great. If you're excited about meeting God and being ingested into the singularity and the matrix, not a great week for you, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Ingested by the sink. Okay, I'm with you. I have nothing else to add, Matt. Well done.
See you next time, Ian.
See you next week. Bye now.